So, today we're going to talk about the whole stretch is better for gains thing for hypertrophy. Um, because, we supposedly have all the data to back it up. The studies show it, right? The influencers say it. You can pretty much go to any video or comment section related to YouTube fitness, and there'll be someone talking about how, the stretch does wonders for hypertrophy. And because it's so much better for hypertrophy because, right? So what is this phenomenon, right? In the past 5 years, everybody's talking about how if you stretch, you get more gains. So let's talk about it. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at the paper, which supposedly proves this hypothesis that the lengthened position training is superior. And then we'll talk about what the studies actually concluded. And essentially what it boils down to is that the methods that are measuring the differences in muscle growth here, like cross-sectional area, are not measuring only muscle growth. Okay. So the dogma right now is that training at length, so it's just another way to say the stretch, lengthened training, equals better growth. So we're seeing it everywhere. We've established this. Basically, the idea is that passive tension at longer muscle lengths adds an extra stimulus for growth. So, right, if I'm doing tricep extensions up here, the idea is that, because my triceps are stretched, that I'm getting all this extra passive tension. And honestly, I can't blame a lot of y'all because on the surface, the data seems to support it. So usually if you have a shortened muscle length group, so say someone's doing push downs and they're like only going to 90 degrees and then coming down, and then you have a lengthened group, well, the shortened group, it's going to show like they get this much muscle growth, right? Often they're using cross-sectional area, and then, the lengthened groups show greater increase in muscle thickness. So a lot of people take this and run with it. They go, oh, well, across all the literature, you have the shortened group and then you have the lengthened group, and the muscle thickness over time, throughout the study, and the result is higher. So people take it and run with it.
I'm going to say go ultra deep for that super big stretch.
What's happening in that deep stretch?
We don't actually know exactly why a stretch stimulates hypertrophy.
So in some cases, it absolutely is true. So like for specific muscles though. So if you take something like calves, right? Excuse my poor drawing skills. But if you take something like calves, right, where you kind of have two muscle groups here, so you got the gastroc and the soleus, which is a smaller one underneath. Really, this large muscle here, the gastroc, is going to have really good leverage when the foot is in flexion like this and then come into parallel, whereas it's going to kind of lose leverage down here. This drawing, it's going to kind of lose leverage down there, right? So in some cases, there's some truth to it, right? Because in order to grow the calves, then the idea would be that if you want to grow it maximally and be able to load the gastroc maximally, which is the largest muscle, you probably just want to be going from here to here, which really just looks and I guess technically is a lengthened partial. But there's a lot more nuance to this than people are letting on. So, of course, if you aren't training it there, you may see a worse result over time. So it might seem here like I'm agreeing with the stretch literature, but I don't. The reason something like calves are going to get a better result is not because of the stretch. It's because they have better leverage in the stretch. So that's the difference. You're not getting more gains for the gastroc because you're coming up here because you're stretching it. You're getting more gains for the gastroc because that's where it has leverage to produce force. Okay? So I hope you can understand that. So I believe that claiming that universally with all muscle groups that training in the lengthened position or doing lengthened partials is better is a broadly unscientific statement that comes from a need to market oneself a certain way. You cannot at once be scientific and say that A is better than C in almost all cases, which I'm sure they don't say all cases, but we literally have people going on podcasts and saying, talking about how great the stretch is. And then the host of the podcast will ask, well, what's happening there? Why? And then the person who's on the podcast will say, we don't even know. Okay. So they outright admit they don't know, but we're still on this as if it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And of course, the fitness industry falls for this hook, line, and sinker because it's so attractive to have this one thing that's so much better for gains than everything else. So when the influencers talk about it, everyone loves the idea of this because it sounds sexy, it's marketable, so everybody runs with it. So let's get all this stuff out of the way. Let's talk about my rebuttals. We'll talk about our method here at H&L Coaching of assessing this. So generally in science, you try to isolate a result. Okay. So let's say this little circle here is the isolated result. And let's say this threshold is where you're measuring, where the study's measuring. Okay. So you would say it's fair to say that if a study is incapable of measuring only this, and then there's a square here, so we're trying to measure this, but we're actually getting the square in at the same time. Well, if a study is incapable, if we're looking for the circle and the study can't just isolate the circle and it's getting the square at the same time, well, then we can't really use this research, right? We're kind of skewing the data here. We can't say that this result of square and circle is an accurate measure of circle because square is there, so you can't say that. So it's not really going to provide good enough results to say anything concrete. And in 2016, they did work on this. So they found that the way they were measuring cross-sectional area of the muscle in a lot of these studies did not take into account the swelling caused by muscle damage, which if you're new here, muscle damage isn't actually a good thing for hypertrophy. It's actually a negative thing. So this damage causes swelling, right? It causes edema, which, when muscle fibers are damaged, water rushes into the interstitial space, and something like an ultrasound, which is used in a lot of this literature, it's going to look the same as muscle growth, right? So you could have the tricep here. Here's the people who did the short end, and oh my God, the people who did the lengthened have so much extra muscle growth. Well, there's going to be a lot more swelling. And it's going to look the same as muscle growth. So I want you to take a wild guess now what type of training causes the most muscle damage. Yeah, you guessed it. Training at longer lengths. So when you train in that overhead position for triceps, or you're doing these, there's nothing wrong with training at longer lengths, but if you are doing that, and you're kind of milking the eccentric too, you're going to get a lot more damage, which therefore causes a lot more swelling. So if you run a 6 or 12 week study comparing lengthened versus shortened position movements, the lengthened group will always have more damage and swelling, which will read like there's significantly more hypertrophy, and this is not the case. So how do we fix this? Well, in order for this to actually be accurate, they would have to include a washout period. So what that is they would take weeks off after the study, right, to allow for the swelling to go down. And now in some studies, like some of the stretch-mediated hypertrophy ones, they did do this. But stretch-mediated hypertrophy is not training at longer lengths, which is another thing people conflate. They're two completely different things. Stretch-mediated hypertrophy is the adaptation you get from stretching, but that's another video. All right, so of course, for something like the overhead tricep study, they did not include a washout period. So they did the 12 weeks, they measured directly after. I believe it might have been a period of a few days, right? But they measured it basically in the grand scheme of things directly after. So then the results come out, Nobody takes into account, edema, which is the little square here. And then everyone concludes that overhead, in lengthened positions, arbitrarily build more muscle than with the arms by the side for tricep extensions. Because the cross-section tissue data, it shows a higher increase in muscle growth. So, it must be true. When, as we discussed, this is largely due to swelling. So now we see where we're at in the fitness industry. You have this study, like the one used to justify the overhead triceps, which blow up. Like, this gets super popular. It's posted on all these like AI slop, reels and stuff like that, where they show, 50% more activation. They have like an AI guy doing a tricep extension, right? So it blows up, and people just say stuff about it as if it's true. And then you have all the smartest science-based influencers running with this data, running all the way to the bank with this data, when if you hold it under any scrutiny, you find a lot of issues with the way this was conducted. Essentially, they are measuring inflammation and calling it hypertrophy. And when people online are reading the abstract of the study and spreading it like it's the truth, this is why every person you see in any comment section about lifting is saying the stretch constitutes all this extra muscle gain. All right, so is the stretch useless? Well, no, of course not. But it's not magic. So what you're really going to look for in terms of growing muscle is how much tension can you accrue, right? How much tension can you accrue, and how can you have good leverage to get that tension? So certain muscles may have poor leverage in the stretch, actually. So a good example is the lats. You're told to do, these big deep stretch rows, right? So you sit, or pullovers, right? You have you're literally sitting like this, right? So you're getting this big deep stretch in the lats, right? But the funny thing is that your lats just end up losing a lot of the leverage they have in that position, and other things take over. So, and you can test this on yourself. So I invite you to try doing a super deep stretch pullover, and you'll feel a stretch in the lats at the top, of course, because they're stretching. But what you might notice is that at the top range, you start to feel the chest a little bit, and the long head of the triceps start to fire. This is because they're taking over the leverage that your lats used to have. So in this case, emphasizing the stretch arbitrarily in this movement makes no sense. Now, if a muscle had good leverage in the lengthened position, like we discussed previously, the calves or the chest, you can emphasize it, but understand that what you're emphasizing isn't actually stretching or stretch-mediated hypertrophy. You're just emphasizing one muscle as the prime mover because it has leverage there, not trying to stretch it. These are two different things. Okay. So that'll be it for me. If you're looking for programming based on actual proven methods in biomechanics and not just the latest trends, check the link in the description for coaching. At H&L Coaching, we sort through the trends and the fitness industry stuff to tell you for real what works and what doesn't. So subscribe if you want to see more.